The next topic we're going to cover is what is called views. These are essentially queries that we give a name to, and we can treat them sort of like the way we treat macros or functions in a programming language. So the syntax for a view is just like this: create view, give it a name, view name, as, and then give it a select statement. And that select statement can now be referred to by the name in this create view statement. This is handy for doing development. Oftentimes, if we're putting together a complex query, we can break it down into sub-pieces and create views for the pieces that we understand, and then compose queries over those views. Just like in software development, where we sometimes have subroutines to help us encapsulate complex logic. Another thing that views get used for is security, particularly access control. So in SQL, security, the ability to, for example, read a table, is granted to objects like tables. So users might be able to read particular tables. Suppose you had a table like the students table where you wanted to let someone see the student names, but not their student IDs or their grades. So you could have a view over that table that just selects out the names, and then you could grant access to that view without granting access to the underlying table. As a result, people would only see the names and they wouldn't see the other columns. A final note on views in SQL: they're evaluated on the fly every time you reference them. They are not materialized into storage. So they're not stored results that you snapshot when you create the view. The creating of the view simply specifies the syntax for evaluating the view when you use it in a query. That means if the underlying tables in the view should change, the results of the view will change as well. Here's an example of a view at the bottom of this slide. It's called red count. And what it's going to do is count up the number of reservations for each red boat. Let's check it out. In the from clause, we join together boats and reserves. And in the where clause, we see that they're joined by BID and that we're only interested in boats whose color is red. We're going to group those by BID. And then in the select list, we see for every boat ID, we're going to return the count of reservations. And remember, these are only red boats. So this is the count of reservations for each red boat. Now, here's that query repeated at the top of this slide. We can use this query in another query. Select star from red count is going to return tuples that are defined by that view. And at the current state of the database on the right-hand side, we see there's just one tuple. It's a boat ID 102, and it has scount 1. But we can also use red count in another query. At the bottom of the screen here, we have join of red count with boats on boat ID. We're looking for those red counted boats that have only been reserved under 10 times. For those, we return their B name, which comes from boats, and their S count, which comes from red count. So you can use views in queries just the way that you would use regular tables in queries. Sometimes we don't want to define a view, perhaps because we don't want to forget to drop it later on. We just want to use it once. And so we can do that while we're writing a query. In essence, we can just define a subquery in the from clause while we're defining our outer query. So look at this example. It's a select query over boats, comma, a subquery in the from clause. So here you see a parenthesized query, which I won't read yet. But at the end of that parenthesized subquery, we see we give it an alias, reds, and then we give the columns of the output of reds aliases too, BID and scount. And so what this query is going to do is it's going to join boats against the results of the subquery where reds.bid, which is the results of the subquery, equals b.bid. So we're joining the subquery with the boats table such that scount, which again comes from the subquery, is less than 10. And if we look inside this subquery, we can see what it's doing. It's joining boats to reserves on BID, color equals red, grouping by BID, and counting. So this is our red boats definition again, but here we didn't give it a view. We just defined it sort of on the fly in the from clause. So that's a perfectly valid thing to do, and most SQL engines will support these kind of queries in the from clause without defining a view that has a name. Here's another syntax for achieving the same goal that's a little bit more structured and arguably easier to read. What we're going to do is we're going to define the subquery ahead of the regular query, but in the same statement, using a with clause. This, by the way, is sometimes called a common table expression, or a CTE. All right, it's going to be an expression that defines a table that can be reused in subsequent parts of the query. So let's look at the syntax. With, and then we give an alias name reds and alias names for the output columns, BID, scount, as, and then we have our subquery, which defines, again, the red boats and their counts. So with reds, BID, scount, as subquery. Here's the rest of the statement. Select b name, comma, scount from boats to b, comma, reds. So you see the reference to the with defined common table expression. And then the where clause and scount are the same as they were on the previous slide. So this statement with the with clause in front of the select statement is equivalent to the query we saw on the previous slide. You can actually define a whole sequence of these queries in the with clause. So this is the same sort of view on the fly syntax using with. First, we're going to define reds, and this is just as it was on the previous slide with reds bid scount as subquery, comma, and we'll define another alias, unpopular reds as, and notice we don't really even need the parentheses here. They were there for clarity, but in this example with unpopular reds, we didn't use them. Unpopular reds as, now we're joining boats b and reds, which we previously defined. Right, so this is the red boats, we're joining back with boats, with scount less than 10. We're defined that as the unpopular reds, and now we can say select star from unpopular reds. So you can see these with clauses can be defined in sequence, and they can refer back to each other. And this allows you to have sort of a cascade of these sub-expressions, these sub-select statements defined and reused later on. Now, let's look back at our ARGMAX example that we did before. We're looking for the sailor with the highest rating per age group. Okay, so this is trickier than what we had before. Before we just had ARGMAX. Now I want to know the ARGMAX for each group. All right, so here's how we're going to do this. First, we're going to find the max rating for each group using a with clause. With max ratings, age, comma, max rating as, select from sailors, we're going to group by age, and then for each age, we're going to group the max rating. So this max ratings subquery gives for every age the maximum rating. And now in the outer query, we can join max ratings with sailors, matching on age for those sailors whose rating is the max rating for their age. So this gives us ARGMAX for each age group.